The arrogant CEO who never trusted love. A transformation story. Vincent Ashford stood in the emergency room of Mount Sinai Hospital, his Tom Ford suit soaked in blood, his hand wrapped in bandages that were already turning crimson. The sharp scent of antiseptic filled the air, monitors beeped, and nurses moved quickly around him. Sitting beside him was Destiny Clark, a woman he had met less than an hour ago. Her natural curls framed her calm face as she texted on his phone, rearranging meetings with his investors and updating his COO without hesitation. Vincent's voice carried the disbelief of the moment. 30 minutes ago, this woman was a complete stranger. Now she's running my entire world while looking at me like I'm the most ridiculous man she's ever met. And for the first time in 15 years, I don't want her to leave. He was a billionaire who had built his life on power and control, a man who swore love was nothing more than distraction. She was a Brooklyn librarian who had unexpectedly saved his life. How does a man who spent 20 years building walls around his heart end up in a hospital with a woman who sees right through him? Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. If stories like this move you, subscribe now. Tomorrow brings another unforgettable story of transformation and love. Let's begin. Vincent Ashford's story began in Brooklyn, long before the suits, the boardrooms, or the skyscraper office that carried his name. He was 8 years old when his mother packed a single suitcase and walked out of their small apartment without looking back. He waited by the window for weeks, certain she would return. She never did. In her absence, his father unraveled into bottles of cheap whiskey, nights on the couch, and mornings too heavy to rise from. By the time Vincent was 12, he was the one checking the mail, handling overdue bills, and making sure food was on the table. At 15, he sat at the kitchen counter with a calculator and his father's unopened letters, trying to keep the electricity on. Childhood slipped away from him the way water slips through clenched fists, too quickly to hold. Survival turned him sharp. He learned that vulnerability carried a price, and trusting anyone could leave him exposed. By his late teens, he had one goal: escape. College wasn't an option with the money he didn't have, so he carved his own path in technology. He rented a small studio in Queens, where his bed doubled as a desk and his meals were instant noodles, eaten while coding through the night. Those early years were lean and merciless, but his discipline hardened into an asset. Every line of code, every project he pushed completion, moved him closer to something beyond survival. The climb was relentless. In less than a decade, that boy from Brooklyn became the founder of a tech company that redefined communication software. By his early 30s, he was negotiating contracts on the top floor of the Chrysler Building, a symbol of a life far removed from his father's half-empty bottles. The press called him ruthless, the kind of leader who could stare down competitors until they folded. For Vincent, success was never about money. It was about control. Control over his environment. Control over his future. Control that no one could take away. But control came at a cost. 3 times he tried to let someone in, and 3 times it ended in failure. The last was Victoria. She was brilliant, ambitious, and for a time, he thought she might be different. Yet on the night she left, her parting words cut deeper than she knew. "You were never really here, Vincent." She wasn't wrong. Even in intimacy, he kept a wall between himself and the other person, guarding the part of him that still remembered waiting at the window for a mother who never came back. That wall became his philosophy. Love, in his view, was a liability. It left people distracted, weakened, exposed. In business, he had seen men crumble because they wanted to be liked or because they trusted too easily. He vowed never to be one of them. If there was one thing his childhood taught him, it was this: the only person you could count on was yourself. By 40, his reputation was fixed. He was a CEO no one crossed, the deal maker who rarely smiled, the billionaire who appeared in magazines but never at family gatherings or vacations. Associates respected him, investors feared him, and rivals avoided him. Employees, however, told a different story. To them, he was a man who measured value not in people, but in performance. If you delivered, you stayed. If you faltered, you were gone. The truth of that judgment landed one morning when his assistant of 4 years walked into his office, carrying a resignation letter. She stood tall, voice steady, her eyes unflinching as she said, "You don't see people, Mr. Ashford. You see functions and failures. I can't work for someone who treats loyalty like a transaction." He didn't argue. He didn't chase after her. He simply watched her leave, the echo of her footsteps fading across the marble floor of his office. On the surface, it was a minor inconvenience. Assistants could be replaced. But somewhere beneath the armor he had worn for decades, her words lingered. He had built his empire on discipline, resilience, and control. Yet in that moment, sitting alone in his office, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows, Vincent felt the faintest shadow of something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't regret exactly. It wasn't grief. It was a quiet recognition that every wall he built might not be protecting him anymore. It might be keeping him locked inside. Still, he brushed the thought away. He had an investor presentation in less than 24 hours, and distractions had no place in his world. The Chrysler building glittered against the morning sky, its polished steel catching the light as Vincent Ashford prepared for the day that could determine the future of his empire. His team had worked for weeks on an investor presentation that was meant to secure a deal worth hundreds of millions. But the one thing he needed, the flash drive containing his speech, financial models, and projections, was nowhere on his desk. He checked drawers, scanned the surface, and felt his chest tighten when he spotted a corner of the device wedged beneath the lower edge of his bookshelf. He crouched, tugging at it, frustration mounting as the minutes ticked away. The bookshelf was taller than he was, packed with heavy binders, awards, and framed memories he rarely noticed. He yanked harder, and in an instant, the weight shifted. The shelf lurched forward. A crash thundered through the office as glass shattered, books spilled, and sharp wooden edges splintered across the floor. Vincent tried to shield himself, but the corner of a shelf carved deep into his palm. The pain was immediate, sharp, followed by warm blood that streaked down his wrist, pooling on the hardwood floor beneath him. For the first time in years, he felt completely helpless. His phone sat across the room, well out of reach. His assistant was gone, and he had less than 3 hours before the investors arrived. Pressure pulsed from the wound, and his vision blurred for a moment as he clutched his hand, trying to slow the bleeding with the hem of his ruined suit. That was when the door opened. Destiny Clark had been on the 46th floor, wrapping up a community outreach meeting for the public library program his company was sponsoring. She heard the crash and hurried toward the noise, her heels clicking against the marble hallway. When she pushed open the glass door to his office, the sight startled her. Vincent Ashford, the man whose name carried weight across Manhattan, was slumped against a broken bookshelf, blood spilling through his fingers. She moved quickly, dropping her tote bag and pulling tissues and sanitizer from inside. "You're losing too much blood," she said firmly. Without asking permission, she pressed the tissues against his palm. "I don't need help," Vincent muttered, wincing as pain shot up his arm. "I just need to get to that meeting." Destiny's eyes narrowed. "You need a hospital. Now." He tried to pull back, but the strength wasn't there. "I don't even know who you are. Who gave you the right?" She cut him off without hesitation. "I'm the person standing here while you bleed all over your floor. And I'm telling you no presentation is worth losing consciousness." Her calm authority disarmed him. He wasn't used to being spoken to that way, certainly not by someone who didn't work for him. For a brief second, He considered arguing further, but another surge of pain reminded him how little control he had in this moment. Destiny tore strips from a handkerchief she found on his desk, binding his palm as tightly as she could. "This will hold until we get there," she said. "You're not walking into any investor meeting like this." Vincent stared at her, studying the poise in her movements, the way she neither flinched at the blood nor hesitated in her decisions. "You don't understand," he said through clenched teeth. "That presentation could change everything." Her voice softened slightly. "You're worried about protecting something. Maybe your company, maybe yourself. But right now, what you're really protecting is your pride. Let it go for once." The word struck deeper than he expected. Protecting himself had been his way of living since childhood. Hearing it called out by a stranger unsettled him more than the throbbing in his hand. Minutes later, she helped him to his feet and guided him toward the private elevator. Vincent resisted again. "I can call my driver." "You'll bleed through your suit before he gets here," Destiny replied. She typed quickly on his phone. He realized she had picked it up when she saw it lying across the room. "I rescheduled your investor meeting for tomorrow. Your COO knows what's happening." He blinked. "You did what?" "You'll thank me later." She didn't even glance up from the screen as she pressed the call button for the elevator. In the garage, Vincent reluctantly handed her the keys to his Mercedes. He was too weak to argue as she started the engine and pulled onto Lexington Avenue. The city roared outside, the horns, the traffic, the relentless energy, but inside the car, silence hung heavy. Finally, Destiny spoke. "Why do you fight so hard to stay in control of everything?" His gaze stayed fixed on the skyline ahead. "Because if you don't, people take advantage." Or maybe, she countered, "because if you let someone in, they might actually see you." Her words lingered as a hospital came into view. Vincent Ashford, the man known for his unshakable authority, sat in the passenger seat of his own car with his hand wrapped in makeshift bandages, realizing that for the first time in decades, he wasn't the one giving orders. He was the one being carried. The emergency room at Mount Sinai was bright and efficient, a place where urgency never stopped moving. Vincent sat on the edge of a hospital bed, his shirt sleeve rolled up while a doctor carefully stitched a long gash across his palm. The antiseptic stung, the needle tugged, but he didn't flinch. He was used to pain, just not this kind. From the corner of the room, Destiny Clark stood with his phone in hand, her tone steady as she spoke with his chief operating officer, Gerald. She had taken command as if she had worked for him for years, calmly informing him of rescheduled calls, shifting investor appointments, and updating the rest of the executive team. Her presence was unshakable, her voice neither rushed nor hesitant. The doctor glanced at her with a polite smile. "Your wife is very organized." "You're lucky." Vincent's head turned sharply. "She's not my wife," he said quickly, the word sharper than intended. He caught Destiny's eyes briefly, and for the first time in a long while, he felt heat rise to his face. Not from anger, but from something else he wasn't ready to name. Destiny didn't miss a beat. She ended the call, slipped the phone into her bag, and crossed the room. Gerald says, and I quote, "It's about damn time something made that man slow down." Vincent blinked. "He said that?" She nodded, a trace of amusement in her expression. "Apparently, you don't slow down for anything or anyone." For reasons he couldn't explain, Vincent laughed. It wasn't the polite chuckle he used in boardrooms, nor the sharp laugh he reserved for negotiations. This was real, unguarded, almost foreign to him. He couldn't remember the last time it had happened. The doctor raised an eyebrow but said nothing, focusing on tying off the final stitch. Destiny, however, noticed the change. She tilted her head slightly, as if committing the sound to memory, then handed him a bottle of water from the counter. When the doctor left, Vincent sat in silence for a moment, flexing his bandaged hand. His mind should have been on tomorrow's meeting, the revisions that needed review, the calls that had to be made. Instead, it lingered on the stranger who had taken charge of his world with such ease. He broke the silence before he could think better of it. "Let me take you to dinner. Tonight." Destiny gave him a look, part surprise and part assessment, as if she were measuring his intent. Then she smiled lightly. "I have book club tonight in Crown Heights. You could come with me." The suggestion caught him off guard. He expected a yes, maybe a no, but not that. "Book club," he repeated, as if testing the words in his mouth. "Every Tuesday," she said, her tone even. "A group of us meet at a friend's brownstone to discuss literature. Tonight, it's Toni Morrison." He almost scoffed. Him, Vincent Ashford, sitting in a Brooklyn brownstone discussing novels with strangers? The idea was absurd. He had deadlines, investors, a company that consumed every hour of his life. But as he sat there, he realized the alternative. Going back to his penthouse, alone, replaying the same endless cycle that had carried him for years. His instincts told him to decline, to reassert control, to return to the empire he had built. Yet something in Destiny's calm, the quiet authority she carried, unsettled his certainty. She wasn't impressed by his wealth, nor intimidated by his title. She treated him like a man, not a symbol. "What time?" he asked, the words leaving his mouth before his logic could stop them. Her smile widened, subtle but genuine. 7 o'clock. In that moment, Vincent knew he had made a decision that could not be measured in profit or loss. He was stepping into something unfamiliar, something that carried no guarantee. For once, he wasn't sure where it would lead. By the time Vincent arrived in Crown Heights, the winter air had settled heavy over Brooklyn. He stepped out of his Mercedes in the same blood-stained Tom Ford suit he had worn to the hospital, an attire that looked absurdly out of place against a row of brownstones lit with warm yellow light. Destiny guided him up the steps of one such home, where laughter spilled in the windows and the scent of baked sweet potatoes reached the sidewalk. Inside, the living room was filled with women, 15 in total, their chairs arranged in a wide circle. Books rested in their laps, marked with notes and tabs. Their conversation flowed with ease, voices layered with passion, warmth, and at times, anger. At the center sat Miss Patricia, the hostess, whose gray hair was wrapped in a vibrant scarf. She glanced at Vincent, scanning his expensive but ruined suit before giving a pointed nod. "If you speak," she said, her voice low and firm, "make sure you have something worth saying." Vincent inclined his head, unsure she meant it as a warning or an invitation. Either way, he settled into a chair near the edge of the circle, silent for now. The group was deep into a discussion of Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. Their words cut into themes he had never confronted. Beauty standards imposed on young black girls, the psychological scars of racism, and how society teaches children to dislike what makes them unique. He listened as if eavesdropping on a world hidden from the glass towers of Manhattan. Jasmine, a young woman in her 20s, shared her story of finally wearing her natural curls to work despite fear of being judged. "For years, I straightened it until my scalp burned," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "I thought that was the only way I'd be taken seriously. But the first day I walked in with my real hair, I felt free in a way I didn't know was possible." Across the room, Mrs. Thompson, the eldest of the group, leaned forward in her chair. "When I was a girl in Mississippi, we weren't allowed in certain stores. We were told we were less before we even had a chance to prove ourselves. That kind of wound doesn't heal easy. But books like Morrison's, they give words to what many of us lived without ever saying out loud." The room quieted as her memories settled among them. Vincent shifted in his seat, struck by the weight of history being carried in these voices. In his own world, power was defined by profit margins and contracts. Here, power lived in stories, in resilience, in the courage to name pain and still laugh afterward. When the discussion paused, Destiny brought out 2 pies. The aroma of cinnamon and butter filled the space as slices of sweet potato pie were passed from hand to hand. Vincent accepted his plate, unsure at first, but the taste was unlike anything he had known. Comfort layered in sweetness, a flavor tied to memory and community. For the next hour, he said little, choosing instead to observe. He noticed the way the women affirmed one another, how disagreements never tore them apart, but drew them deeper into understanding. There was no posturing, no competition. It was the opposite of his boardroom, where silence was weakness and every voice carried an agenda. Finally, Miss Patricia turned to him. "Mr. Ashford," she said, using his full name as though testing how it sounded in her mouth. "You've been quiet. What did you hear tonight?" The room turned toward him, eyes steady but not hostile. Vincent took a slow breath. For once, he didn't reach for the polished answers that usually came so easily. He spoke honestly. "I've spent my life in rooms full of powerful people," he said carefully, his voice lower than usual. "But I learned more tonight than in years of those meetings. Listening here, I realized how much I missed by thinking success only lived in towers of glass and steel." There was a pause, and then a few heads nodded. Ms. Patricia leaned back, satisfied. "That," she said, "was worth saying." The group resumed its conversation, but Vincent barely heard them now. His mind was racing, not with strategies or projections, but with the unsettling awareness that his world was smaller than he thought. In one evening, among strangers in a Brooklyn brownstone, he had stepped into something larger than himself, something money could never buy. When the meeting finally ended, the women lingered, laughing and exchanging hugs. Vincent followed Destiny toward the door, the taste of sweet potato pie still on his tongue and the sound of voices echoing in his mind. For the first time in decades, he felt like a guest in a space that welcomed him without asking for anything in return. The book club ended with laughter spilling into the hallway as coats were gathered and goodbyes exchanged. Vincent stepped outside with Destiny, the air sharp with winter cold. Snow had started to fall, soft flakes catching the glow of streetlights. The Brooklyn streets were quiet, the usual rhythm of traffic softened by the storm. For once, Vincent didn't feel the need to rush. They walked side by side, their steps leaving a trail behind them on the sidewalk. Vincent glanced at Destiny, who tucked her scarf tighter around her neck, her curls dusted with snow. She walked with a kind of ease he had never mastered, the ease of someone who belonged, not because of wealth or status, but because of certainty in herself. At the corner of Franklin Avenue, near the subway entrance, they paused beneath a lamppost. The train rumbled faintly below, the city alive even in stillness. Destiny turned to him, her expression unreadable, her eyes sharp but not unkind. "I don't date men who are looking for a novelty or an experience," she said. Her voice was steady, carrying no accusation, only clarity. Vincent held her gaze. He had spent a lifetime commanding boardrooms, silencing opponents with words, but now the truth pressed out of him unpolished. "I'm not sure what I'm looking for," he admitted, his voice lower than usual. "But I know you made me feel more human tonight than I have in years." The word surprised even him. Vulnerability wasn't something he allowed, not in business and not in life. Yet standing there in the snow, it seemed like the only honest thing to say. Destiny studied him for a long moment, as if weighing not just his words but the man himself. Finally, she gave a small nod. "If you want to see me again, meet me at the literacy program in Brownsville. Saturday, 9 o'clock sharp. Not as Vincent Ashford, the CEO, just as Vincent." The simplicity of the challenge cut deeper than any contract negotiation ever had. He opened his mouth to reply, but she stepped closer before he could. With one swift, gentle motion, She adjusted the collar of his coat, brushing away a clump of snow. It was an ordinary gesture, yet it carried a weight he hadn't felt in years. Care without condition, attention without motive. "Start thinking about what you're ready to stop protecting," she said softly. Her words lingered in the cold air. She turned toward the subway entrance, her steps purposeful as she disappeared down the stairs. Vincent remained where he stood, watching until she was gone. The snow continued to fall around him, gathering on his shoulders, dampening the fabric of his suit. He didn't move. For the first time in decades, he felt the sharp sting of winter not as discomfort, but as proof that he was alive, alone on a Brooklyn street. With nothing but the echo of her words and the trace of her touch on his collar, Vincent realized he had a choice to make. He could retreat to the world he knew, his penthouse, his empire, his carefully guarded solitude, or he could step into a life that demanded something far scarier than risk: honesty. For a man who had built walls around every part of himself, that single decision felt more daunting than any billion-dollar deal. Yet beneath the falling snow, he knew the walls were no longer as strong as they once were. Vincent arrived outside the community center in Brownsville just before 9. The sky was gray, the streets damp from melted snow, and for once he wasn't wrapped in layers of silk ties or pressed suits. He wore jeans and a navy sweater, the kind of clothes he rarely chose because they felt too bare, too ordinary. Today, that was the point. Inside, the building buzzed with the sound of children. The literacy program filled a multipurpose room lined with bookshelves and mismatched tables. Volunteers were already seated with kids, reading stories, sounding out words. Destiny stood near the back, handing out materials. When she saw him, she offered a small smile, acknowledgement without ceremony. He was quickly introduced to Jamal, an 8-year-old boy with restless energy. Jamal folded his arms, refusing to open the superhero book on the table. "I don't read out loud," he muttered. Beside him sat Aisha, 12 years old, her braids tied with bright beads. She avoided Vincent's eyes, her lips pressed tight as if words were trapped behind them. Destiny leaned in and whispered, "She stutters. She's smart, just nervous." Vincent sat down awkwardly, feeling more out of place than he ever had in a boardroom. For the first few minutes, he tried coaxing Jamal to read a single sentence, but the boy turned his face away. Vincent exhaled, realizing brute force wasn't going to work. He picked up the book himself and began reading softly, narrating the superhero's battle as if it were the most important deal of his life. When Jamal peeked over, Vincent paused. "You know," he said, lowering his voice, "I grew up in Brooklyn too. My mom left when I was your age. My dad drank a lot. I used to feel like the world didn't see me. Books were the only place I felt like I could escape." The room seemed to still for Jamal, who blinked at him. "For real?" Vincent nodded. "For real. Reading those stories gave me strength. They made me believe I could be more than what I saw around me." Slowly, Jamal slid the book closer and began to stumble through a sentence. His voice wavered, but he kept going. Vincent stayed quiet, letting him work through the words. Destiny, standing across the room, watched as Vincent's posture softened, as the sharp edges of his usual presence melted into patience. By the time Jamal finished a full page, the boy was grinning, proud and breathless. Aisha clapped for him, and other kids nearby joined in. Vincent smiled, an unguarded, genuine smile that even surprised him. After the session ended, Destiny invited Vincent to lunch at a soul food spot in Bed-Stuy. The restaurant was small, with framed photos of jazz musicians on the walls and the smell of fried chicken and collard greens filling the air. They found a corner booth, and for the first time, it felt like a real date. Over plates of cornbread and sweet tea, Vincent asked, "How did you get into this work?" Destiny stirred her drink. "My grandmother raised me. She always said, Love isn't something you find. It's something you become. She believed you don't wait for life to hand you meaning. You create it by showing up for others. Vincent leaned back, her words cutting deeper than any business principle he'd ever studied. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted quietly. "I don't know how to be open." Destiny smiled, her expression gentle but firm. "You're already doing it. You showed up. That's the first step." He looked at her across the table, the noise of the restaurant fading into the background. For once, he wasn't calculating or strategizing. He was simply present, a man learning how to breathe outside the armor he had built. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Vincent had ever experienced. His life, once measured by quarterly reports and late-night calls from international investors, began to take on a new rhythm. Saturday mornings were no longer reserved for urgent strategy meetings, but for the literacy program in Brownsville. He and Destiny worked side by side with the kids, Vincent slowly becoming less stiff each week, learning how to listen, how to encourage without control. Sundays often meant walks through Prospect Park. Destiny preferred quiet paths over crowded trails, and Vincent found himself enjoying the slower pace, the crunch of gravel underfoot, the way she carried a book tucked beneath her arm as if it were as necessary as breath. Late nights sometimes ended at Brooklyn diners, the kind with neon lights and laminated menus. They'd talk for hours over black coffee and sweet potato pie, conversations that ranged from literature to business to childhood scars. But Destiny wasn't content to let their connection exist only in her world. One evening, Vincent invited her into his. The occasion was a charity gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She arrived in a deep green gown that drew every eye in the room, yet she carried herself without pretense. When board members and donors questioned her background, subtly, as though her being a librarian from Brooklyn made her an oddity, she smiled and responded with grace that disarmed even the sharpest inquiries. Not everyone hid their skepticism well. Some colleagues whispered, some stared too long. The surprise wasn't just that Vincent had brought a date, but that she wasn't from their usual orbit of wealth and privilege. Still, she moved through the evening with poise, speaking with Gerald, Vincent's COO, about education equity and technology's role in expanding access. By the end of the night, Gerald pulled Vincent aside. "She's sharper than half the people in this room," he said. "You might finally have someone who challenges you." The challenge came in more ways than one. At his next board meeting, Vincent stunned the room by announcing a new initiative. Ashford Innovations would partner with public libraries in underserved communities, funding digital literacy programs, technology labs, and outreach projects. The boardroom erupted in murmurs. This was not the Vincent Ashford they knew. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't designed to squeeze out profit margins. One director finally asked, "This doesn't align with our growth model. What's the strategy here?" Vincent leaned forward, his hands folded. "Maybe I've been measuring success wrong. For years, I thought growth meant numbers on a screen. But if our technology doesn't serve the people who need it most, what are we really building?" The statement landed heavily. Some were unimpressed, but others, Gerald included, watched him with a new respect. Beyond the boardroom, Vincent's personal transformation deepened. At night, he began reading the works Destiny loved, stumbling through Toni Morrison's prose with seriousness that showed his intent. "I want to understand the world that shaped you," he told her one evening as they sat on her couch in Crown Heights. She teased him about mispronouncing names but kissed his forehead for the effort. Destiny, in turn, helped him see beyond balance sheets. On long walks, she pointed out small details he would have ignored. The mural on a corner building, the street vendor selling poetry chapbooks, the grandmother teaching her granddaughter double dutch on the sidewalk. For a man who had spent his life staring up at skyscrapers, these simple acts of community were revelations. Their bond grew stronger with each moment. until one evening they found themselves on the Brooklyn Bridge just before sunset. The Manhattan skyline glowed across the river, glass towers catching the last light of day. Vincent rested his hands on the railing, Destiny beside him. He turned to her, the city stretching out as their backdrop, and leaned closer. Their first kiss was quiet, unhurried, the kind that marked a turning point not with fireworks but with certainty. For Vincent Ashford, who had once sworn love was weakness, it was proof that strength could look entirely different than he had ever believed. Vincent sat in the sleek conference room of Ashford Innovations, the glow of the city reflecting off the glass walls. His advisors had gathered to present the largest acquisition the company had ever considered. The numbers were staggering, the potential profit immense, but the terms demanded a version of himself he no longer recognized. The ruthless, calculating, emotionally distant man who had built an empire at any cost. "This is the opportunity you've worked for," one partner said, leaning forward. "This is who you are, Vincent. Don't lose yourself in some fantasy. The board expects decisive action. You can't let sentiment dictate strategy." Vincent's palms rested on the polished table. For years, this man he had been, the man who measured life in spreadsheets and quarterly reports, was the only version he had allowed to exist. But that version had never felt alive the way he did walking through Brownsville or laughing with Destiny over fried chicken and bed stewie. That evening, he told Destiny about the offer. She listened carefully, her expression calm but unwavering. "I won't tell you what to do," she said softly, "but I will tell you this. I fell in love with the man who showed up in Brownsville, not the man who hid behind his empire." Her words resonated deeply. He realized the choice wasn't between love and success. It was between the man he had always been and the person he wanted to become. It was about integrity, presence, and the courage to live differently. The next board meeting was decisive. Vincent stood at the head of the room, his hands folded over the presentation materials. "I've considered the acquisition, the projections, and the strategy," he began. "This deal aligns with profit margins, but it does not align with purpose. I spent 20 years building walls because I thought they would protect me. All they did was keep me from living." Murmurs spread across the room, eyes widening. He continued, outlining a new initiative. Ashford Innovations would now focus on projects that serve communities, invested in public libraries, and funded education programs in underserved neighborhoods. Technology would no longer only generate wealth, it would generate opportunity. His colleagues reacted with disbelief, some with quiet admiration. Gerald, sitting near the back, gave a small nod of approval. Vincent's voice remained steady, resolute. He had chosen a life that felt honest, the life that allowed him to remain present, connected, and capable of love. 6 months later, snow fell lightly outside Miss Patricia's brownstone in Crown Heights. Vincent and Destiny sat side by side at the book club, their focus on James Baldwin. Vincent was fully engaged, offering insights, listening intently, laughing when appropriate. The man who had once treated human connection as secondary was now fully present, learning as much as he contributed. At the meeting's close, Destiny's hand found Vincent's. The warmth of her touch lingered as they stepped into the quiet Brooklyn street, snowflakes settling gently on their shoulders. Vincent inhaled the cold air, feeling alive in a way his office in Manhattan had never provided. The two worlds he had once separated, the empire and the community, were now a shared journey. He thought about how much he had protected himself, the walls built over decades. "I thought love was a weakness," he reflected inwardly, watching Destiny smile in the falling snow. "Turns out, it was the only thing strong enough to save me." They walked down the street together, the city lights reflecting off wet pavement, their hands intertwined, each step a quiet declaration of change. Vincent had chosen presence, connection, and authenticity. For the first time in his life, He felt unshakable not because of wealth or power, but because of love, the kind that required courage, humility, and the willingness to trust. As they disappeared into the Brooklyn night, Vincent realized he'd become a man who could embrace both worlds, whose empire now extended beyond towers of steel and glass, reaching into hearts and communities. And with destiny beside him, there was no wall he could not dismantle. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Share in the comments where you're watching from and what this story meant to you. Don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow we'll share another story of transformation and love that will inspire you. Your support ensures we continue sharing stories that remind us of courage, connection, and the power of choosing to live fully.